A billionaire gasps for breath on cold pavement. Thomas kneels, dirty hands performing miracles, unaware he's saving the very man who abandoned him before birth. Billionaire collapses on street isn't just headline news. It's the moment fate stitches together lives torn apart by time and wealth. Blood recognizes blood, even when minds cannot remember what was never known. Thomas pulled his threadbare coat tighter around his shoulders as the December wind cut through Manhattan's concrete valleys with merciless precision, carrying the promise of snow and the certainty of another night where warmth would be a luxury beyond his reach. The sidewalks teemed with the usual afternoon crowd, office workers with determined strides, tourists with upturned faces, and the privileged with shopping bags bearing names Thomas recognized but could never afford, all of them unconsciously parting around him like water around a stone, their eyes sliding past him as if his 48 years of existence had been slowly erased by the 3 years he'd spent without an address. He had become accustomed to this particular form of invisibility, learning to use it to his advantage when necessary, finding the corners of the city where he could exist undisturbed, collecting aluminum cans from receptacles that yielded just enough to keep hunger at bay for another day. The corner of 5th and 51st was his afternoon post, a strategic location where the confluence of business people and tourists created a steady stream of discarded coffee cups with occasional change forgotten in the rush, and where the heating vent from the luxury department store provided blessed warmth that rose through the sidewalk grate beneath him. Thomas settled into his usual spot, his weathered hands, once capable of crafting fine cabinetry before the accident that crushed 3 fingers and eventually led to the loss of his job, his apartment, and finally his dignity, now cradling a paper cup containing 37 cents and a crumpled dollar bill. He avoided looking directly at the passers-by, having learned that eye contact often made people uncomfortable, causing them to clutch their belongings closer and quicken their pace, as if poverty might be contagious, or his desperation might manifest as something dangerous, rather than the quiet despair that actually filled him. The first snowflakes began to fall, delicate crystalline structures that seemed to hover momentarily before committing to their descent, and Thomas watched them with the detached appreciation of a man who had learned to find beauty in small things when larger joys had become inaccessible. Across the street, emerging from a gleaming black town car that purred with expensive precision, Thomas noticed an older man in an impeccably tailored charcoal overcoat, his silver hair catching the afternoon light, his bearing suggesting the kind of confidence that comes from never having to question one's place in the world. Even from a distance, Thomas could recognize wealth, not just in the clothes or the car, but in the invisible bubble of deference that surrounded the man, as the doorman bowed slightly and others instinctively moved out of his path, a stark contrast to Thomas's own invisibility that required no accommodations from strangers. The wealthy man paused on the sidewalk, his hand suddenly rising to his chest, in a gesture that Thomas recognized immediately, having witnessed his father make the same motion decades ago before collapsing at a family barbecue, the unmistakable prelude to a heart attack. Thomas was moving before conscious thought could form, his years on the street having taught him to act on instinct when necessary, dropping his meager collection cup and pushing through the crowd that had already begun to form a curious circle around the stricken man. The billionaire's knees buckled as Thomas reached him, his expensive wool coat cushioning his fall only slightly as he crumpled to the cold concrete, his face contorted in pain, and his breathing already becoming the labored gasping that Thomas knew signaled serious trouble. "Call 911!" Thomas shouted to the gathering crowd, his voice carrying an authority that parted the wall of onlookers, several of whom immediately produced phones and began dialing with manicured fingers that trembled slightly at the unexpected drama interrupting their afternoon routines. Thomas knelt beside the fallen man, noting the blue tinge already spreading across his lips and the terrified awareness in his eyes, the universal look of a person confronting their own mortality without warning or preparation. With practiced movements that belied his current station in life, Thomas loosened the man's silk tie and positioned him flat on the ground, placing one hand over the other on the center of the billionaire's chest. Feeling the expensive fabric of a suit that probably cost more than Thomas had earned in his last year of employment. "I'm going to help you," Thomas said with quiet confidence, looking directly into the man's eyes, attempting to convey the certainty he didn't entirely feel as he began compressions, counting under his breath and putting his weight behind each push, knowing that cracked ribs were preferable to death and that hesitation now would only decrease the stranger's chances of survival. Time seemed to suspend itself as Thomas worked, his world narrowing to the rhythm of compressions, the stranger's face, and his own steady counting, barely registering the crowd that had formed a respectful perimeter around them, or the distant wail of approaching sirens that promised professional help was on its way. In those moments of intense focus, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose, of being essential rather than superfluous, his actions mattering in a way that transcended the social barriers that had defined his existence for too long. Robert Caldwell awoke to the antiseptic brightness of a hospital room, the steady beep of monitors creating a technological lullaby that confirmed he remained among the living, despite the crushing pain that had convinced him otherwise on that snowy Manhattan sidewalk. The room screamed luxury, even in its clinical setting. A private suite with tasteful artwork on the walls, a window view of Central Park now dusted with snow, and an arrangement of flowers that would have cost a week's salary for most of the hospital staff attending him. His first coherent thought was not of gratitude for his survival or concern about his business empire temporarily without its leader, but rather of the face that had hovered above him in those terrifying moments, weathered, unshaven, with eyes that held a strange, familiar quality he couldn't place, eyes that had looked at him with pure human concern rather than the calculation or deference he'd grown accustomed to seeing in others. "Mr. Caldwell, you're awake," said a doctor as she entered the room, her white coat impeccably pressed, her clipboard held like a shield, and her expression professionally optimistic in a way that suggested she had delivered both good and terrible news throughout her career with the same composed demeanor. "You suffered a significant cardiac event, but thanks to the immediate CPR you received, we were able to stabilize you without permanent damage to your heart tissue. You're extremely fortunate that someone with CPR training was present when you collapsed. Another minute or two without oxygen to your brain, and we would be having a very different conversation right now." The doctor continued her explanation of stents and medications, of lifestyle modifications and follow-up appointments, but Robert found his attention drifting back to the face of the man who had knelt beside him on the sidewalk. The incongruity of being saved by someone society had discarded, not lost on a man who had spent decades evaluating human worth primarily through financial metrics. "The man who helped me," Robert interrupted the doctor's methodical explanation of his recovery timeline, his voice raspier than usual, but still carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his questions answered immediately. "The homeless man who performed CPR, where is he?" The doctor's expression flickered briefly with surprise before settling back into professional neutrality, her clipboard lowering slightly as she regarded her wealthy patient with newfound curiosity. "He was brought in with you, Mr. Caldwell. The paramedics insisted since he refused to leave your side in the ambulance. He's in the waiting room, I believe. Hospital policy wouldn't normally allow—" Robert cut her off with a raised hand, a gesture so habitual he didn't even realize he was making it. "Send him in, immediately, and arrange for him to be given whatever he needs, food, clothes, a shower if he wants one." Thomas entered the hospital room 30 minutes later, his appearance transformed by the basic necessities Robert had commanded be provided. his face clean-shaven, his hair trimmed, and his body clothed in simple but new attire that the hospital staff had procured from the gift shop and nearby department store. Despite these superficial changes, the essential dignity that Robert had glimpsed on the sidewalk remained, a core of humanity untouched by the circumstances that had reduced this man to living on the streets. The billionaire struggled to sit up straighter in his bed, suddenly conscious of the power imbalance between them, aware that for the first time in decades he was the vulnerable one in an interaction. "You saved my life," Robert stated simply, the words inadequate to express the debt he felt, yet unsure how else to begin this conversation with a stranger who now held such significance in his continued existence. "Anyone would have done the same," Thomas replied. Though both men recognized the polite fiction in this statement, dozens had stood watching while only Thomas had acted, crossing the invisible boundary that separated their worlds to provide help when it was needed most. A silence stretched between them, filled with the beeping monitors and the distant sounds of hospital activity, until Robert gestured to the chair beside his bed, a silent invitation that Thomas accepted after a moment's hesitation. "My name is Robert Caldwell," the billionaire offered, although the introduction was unnecessary. His face had appeared on enough magazine covers and news programs that anonymity was impossible, even to someone who might not follow the business world closely. "Thomas Riley," came the response, the name delivered without embellishment or explanation, a simple declaration of identity from a man who had little else to claim as his own. "Mr. Riley, Thomas, I owe you my life," Robert continued, his fingers absently tracing the edge of the hospital blanket, a nervous gesture at odds with his usual boardroom confidence. "I'd like to offer you a position if you're willing to consider it. I need someone I can trust, someone who has proven their character rather than someone seeking advantage. I have no family, few true friends, and an organization filled with people whose loyalty extends only as far as their compensation packages. What I'm proposing may sound strange, but I'd like you to consider becoming my personal assistant and confidant." The words hung in the air between them, their implications expanding to fill the space. An offer that would lift Thomas from the streets directly into the inner circle of one of the world's wealthiest men. A proposition so unlikely that it seemed plucked from fiction rather than unfolding in the sterile reality of a hospital room on a snowy December afternoon in New York City. 3 months into his new position, Thomas stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of Robert's penthouse office, 62 stories above the Manhattan streets where he had once sought shelter. The city spread before him like an intricate model, its buildings and avenues reduced to miniature perfection by distance and height. The transformation of his circumstances had been so rapid and complete that sometimes Thomas found himself gripping the solid surfaces around him. The marble countertops in his new apartment, the mahogany desk in his office adjacent to Robert's, the leather seats in the town car that now transported him through the city, as if to reassure himself that this new reality would not dissolve beneath his touch like a particularly vivid dream. His days were now filled with scheduling meetings, filtering communications, accompanying Robert to medical appointments that the billionaire insisted on keeping private from his executive team, and slowly learning the complex web of business interests that comprised the Caldwell Empire, a corporate kingdom built over 4 decades by the man who now trusted Thomas with its daily operations and, increasingly, its future direction. Robert watched Thomas from his desk, noting the straight posture and contemplative stillness that had initially drawn his attention in the hospital, qualities that seemed incongruous with someone who had experienced such hardship, yet retained such dignity. The past 12 weeks had confirmed Robert's instinct that Thomas possessed an intelligence and capability that circumstances rather than capacity had kept hidden from the world. His new assistant absorbing complex business concepts with surprising speed and demonstrating an intuitive understanding of people that Robert himself had often lacked in his relentless pursuit of wealth. More surprising was the ease with which they had settled into a relationship that transcended employer and employee, a connection that felt oddly familiar despite its newness, as if they were picking up a conversation long ago interrupted rather than beginning one from scratch. "Thomas!" Robert called across the expansive office, his voice stronger now than in the hospital, but carrying the new hesitancy that his brush with mortality had instilled. "Would you look at these photographs from the Sullivan negotiation? Something about their proposal doesn't sit right with me, and I value your perspective." Thomas crossed the office to Robert's desk, accepting the folder of materials related to a potential acquisition that represented a significant expansion of Caldwell Industries' manufacturing division. But as he reached for the documents, his attention was caught by a framed photograph partially visible beneath the papers, a younger Robert standing beside a beautiful dark-haired woman, both smiling with the unself-conscious joy of people captured in a genuine moment of happiness. Without thinking, Thomas lifted the photograph for a closer look, something in the woman's features triggering a recognition so profound that he felt momentarily dizzy, the office seeming to tilt around him as memories long suppressed rushed forward with devastating clarity. "This woman," Thomas said, his voice barely audible, his fingers tightening around the frame to steady himself. "Who is she?" Robert's expression shifted from mild curiosity to sudden guardedness, the change subtle but unmistakable to Thomas, who had spent months learning to read the micro-expressions that often revealed the billionaire's true thoughts beneath his carefully maintained public persona. "Elizabeth Mitchell," Robert replied after a pause that stretched just long enough to suggest significance beyond a simple identification, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face as he spoke. "She was someone important to me many years ago, before I built most of this." He gestured vaguely at the office and the empire it represented, his usual pride in his accomplishments notably absent from the gesture. "You recognize her," Robert added, a statement rather than a question, his gaze sharpening with sudden intensity as he studied Thomas's reaction with the same analytical focus he typically reserved for balance sheets and market projections. Thomas placed the photograph carefully back on the desk, his hand trembling slightly as he withdrew it, feeling as though the solid ground of his new life was shifting beneath him, revealing fault lines he had not known existed. "She was my mother," he said simply, the three words bridging decades of separation and silence, connecting two lives that had orbited each other unknowingly until a heart attack on a Manhattan sidewalk had altered their trajectories. The revelation hung between them like a physical presence, reshaping the air in the office and casting their entire relationship in a new and complex light that neither man had anticipated when Thomas had pressed his hands against Robert's chest 3 months earlier, forcing a failing heart to continue its rhythm. Robert's face drained of color, the resemblance between him and Thomas suddenly unmistakable once the possibility had been voiced. The same strong jawline, the identical habit of tensing their left hand when processing difficult information, the similar cadence to their speech that several business associates had commented on with curiosity over recent weeks. "Elizabeth was pregnant when she left," Robert said finally, his voice hollow with the realization, memories rearranging themselves into a new narrative that included not just his abandonment, but its consequences, embodied in the man standing before him. "She never told me. I would have." He stopped, unable to complete the sentence with any certainty. The truth of what he would or wouldn't have done at 23, ambitious and ruthless, confronted with an unexpected pregnancy, lost to the intervening decades of choices made without this knowledge. "She tried," Thomas said, the words emerging from a place of buried hurt he had thought long since cauterized by time and survival. "She told me years later that she had gone to your office 3 times, but your secretary never let her pass the lobby. She wrote letters that were returned unopened. Eventually, she accepted that you had made your choice, and she made hers. To raise me alone, to give me her name instead of yours, to never speak badly of you even when I asked why other children had fathers and I did not." Thomas's voice remained steady, decades of resilience allowing him to speak these truths without breaking, though the pain was visible in his eyes to anyone willing to truly see it. "She died of cancer when I was 22, still keeping the promise she made to herself never to bitter me against a father I'd never met. The irony that I've spent the last 3 months working alongside you, neither of us knowing the truth, would have made her laugh in that way she had, finding humor in life's darkest moments." Spring had transformed Central Park into a verdant sanctuary by the time Robert and Thomas settled into their new understanding of each other, the initial shock of their discovered connection giving way to cautious exploration of shared history and tentative construction of a relationship without precedent or blueprint. They walked together along the reservoir path, Robert's pace slower than it had been before his heart attack, but purposeful, his expensive shoes incongruous against the crushed gravel, while Thomas moved with the natural ease of someone who had spent years traversing the city on foot by necessity rather than choice. The 6 weeks since their discovery had been filled with difficult conversations, with silences both comfortable and strained, with medical appointments that now carried genetic significance for both men, and with legal meetings discreetly arranged to begin the process of officially acknowledging what biology and coincidence had revealed. "My doctors say I have perhaps a year," Robert said, as they reached a bench overlooking the water, his tone matter-of-fact rather than self-pitying, a businessman accustomed to assessing situations based on available data rather than desired outcomes. Thomas absorbed this information without visible reaction, having suspected as much from the medications he had been managing for Robert and the hushed conversations with specialists that he had partially overheard, his expression remaining composed even as his internal landscape shifted to accommodate this timeline that seemed cruelly abbreviated now that they had found each other. "What do you want to do with the time?" Thomas asked. The question simple but laden with significance, offering Robert the dignity of agency in facing his mortality rather than empty reassurances or premature grief. The billionaire smiled slightly at the directness that had become the foundation of their relationship, the absence of pretense or performance that made Thomas unlike anyone else in his carefully constructed world. "I want to make amends," he replied, watching a pair of rowing sculls glide across the reservoir's surface with practiced precision. "Not just to you, though that stands above everything else, but for other choices made during a lifetime of prioritizing profit over people. The board won't like what I'm planning," Robert continued after a moment, his gaze still fixed on the water, but his mind clearly focused on the empire he had built and would soon leave behind. "I've instructed my attorneys to prepare the necessary documents to name you as my heir, not just to my personal fortune, but to controlling interest in Caldwell Industries. There will be resistance, accusations of manipulation, or undue influence from a dying old man, possibly even attempts to challenge your identity despite the DNA tests we've already completed." He turned to Thomas then, his expression revealing the steel that had built a business empire from nothing, a determination that even terminal illness could not erode. "I need to know if you're prepared for what this will mean, the scrutiny, the responsibility, the fundamental change to your life that will extend far beyond what you've already experienced. I won't force this legacy upon you if it's not what you want." Thomas considered the question with the thoroughness Robert had come to expect from him, neither rushing to accept out of obligation nor rejecting out of lingering resentment, weighing the implications from multiple angles before responding. 3 months ago, I was collecting aluminum cans to afford a meal. 6 months before that, I had a job at a warehouse until automation eliminated my position. A year before that, I still had an apartment and believed I could rebuild after the accident that took my career in carpentry. He flexed his damaged hand unconsciously, the 3 fingers that had never regained full mobility, a constant reminder of how quickly circumstances could change. What I've learned through all of it is that money and position are tools, not identities. If I accept this responsibility, it won't be to become the person you were, but to use these tools in service of who I already am. Robert nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression, as if Thomas's answer had confirmed something he had already suspected about the son he had never known, until chance and crisis had brought them together at the 11th hour of his life. "Then we have work to do," he said, rising from the bench with renewed purpose, "and not much time to do it in." As they walked back toward the waiting town car, a father and son separated for decades and united by improbable circumstances. Their shadows stretched long across the path behind them, one cast by a life of wealth and power now facing its conclusion, the other by a life of hardship and resilience now facing unexpected transformation. Between them formed a third shadow, indistinct but undeniable, the emerging shape of a legacy being reimagined through forgiveness, through recognition of shared blood and separate journeys, through the complicated alchemy of turning regret into redemption before time rendered such transformations impossible. The trees above them rustled with spring leaves too new to have witnessed the beginning of their story, but would remain long after its conclusion, silent sentinels to the impermanence of human lives and the enduring possibility of healing, even wounds so deep they had shaped decades of separate existence. Thomas felt the weight of Robert's hand on his shoulder as they walked, a simple gesture that bridged the chasm between the life he had lived and the one that now opened before him, between the father he had never known and the father he would all too briefly have, between a past defined by absence and a future shaped by presence, however limited by time and circumstance. In that moment, with Manhattan's skyline rising before them like a concrete forest filled with buildings bearing the Caldwell name, Thomas recognized that inheritance was more than wealth or property or corporate control. It was also the passing of stories, of choices made and unmade, of the chance to write new endings to old beginnings. Their car waited at the park entrance, its black surface reflecting the afternoon sun, a modern chariot to carry them back to the glass and steel tower where they would continue the work of legal transformation that would parallel their personal one, turning Thomas Riley, once invisible on city streets, into Thomas Caldwell Riley, heir to an empire built by the father he had saved without knowing the blood they shared. "Are you ready for tomorrow's meeting with the executive team?" Robert asked as they approached the vehicle. The question ostensibly about business, but carrying the deeper inquiry about Thomas's readiness to step from shadows into scrutiny, from anonymity into legacy. Thomas looked at the father he had found too late, yet somehow just in time, at the complex man whose abandonment had shaped the beginning of his life, and whose recognition would now shape its continuation, and answered with the simple truth that had guided him through homelessness and hope alike: "I'm ready for whatever comes next."